We're talking today with Peter Connors, president of Remcon Plastics in Reading. Peter, thank you for taking time today.
Oh, happy to have you here.
Your company has been in Reading for some time, but you didn't start here.
No.
How'd that happen?
I started the business, we actually started molding in 1983, and the first space that I found was very close to my home in Radnor, which was in Conshohocken. So it was in the old Lee Tire building, which was famous for years as a designation for the traffic helicopter. The Lee Tire curve of the Schuylkill Expressway was something you listened for in the morning to see if there was a jam there. So we were in the Lee Tire building from '83 until 1990. And in late '89, the owners of the building wanted to convert the entire building to offices. So they wanted to get rid of me because I was the only manufacturer who had strange odors. And I had signed a bunch of multi-year extensions. So I said, I really can't afford to leave. And the owner of the building pulled out his checkbook and said, what's it going to cost to buy out the rest of your lease extensions? And I wasn't smart enough to say I need to think about that. So I said $100,000, and he wrote me a check. And so I started to look for another building now that I had the money to cover the moving costs. And started to look in Philadelphia, and just didn't think I wanted to deal with all of my employees having to pay 4.5%, I think it was then, city wage tax, and to deal with the bureaucracy of Philadelphia. So I started to look out as far as Pottstown, and then one of the realtors said, oh, you really ought to go look as far as Reading. So I came out here and I looked at this building, and at the time they wanted almost $2 million for this building. So I kind of ignored it and kept up my search. And one day I happened to call the realtor, who actually is still here in Reading. It was a guy named Bob Powers.
Okay.
I saw him in a restaurant the other day, and said, you know, whatever happened to that building on Chestnut Street? And he said, oh, they have an offer on the building. And I said, what's the offer? He said, $400,000. Well, that's a long way from $2 million. So we started to bid and ended up buying the building for about $950,000, and really got launched here because there was a young woman named Pam Davis working for Meridian Bank who was just the most phenomenal banker and the most networked person I ever met.
Is she still around?
No, she ended up going down into Philadelphia. But I still see her pop up for every once in a while on Facebook.
Right.
So, but she was just incredible. And she knew what programs the state had. So she hooked me up with Ed Swoyer over at Greater Berks. The city had some federal monies. So there was a young kid then named Kerry Roble who was in charge of their program. So I got some low interest loans from both the city of Reading, that was a federal loan, and some from the state of Pennsylvania. And that's what really helped us locate here.
The city gets a bad rap now a lot of times for how it doesn't seem to be as welcoming to business today. It doesn't sound like that was your experience.
No, it wasn't, but that was 21 years ago.
Right.
And I think part of the problem today is, you know, what financial condition is the city in? But the mayor was just here a couple of weeks ago. Ellen Horan was taking him around to meet different business leaders. And I have to say, I was pretty impressed.
Impressed from the standpoint of?
I think he's got the right attitude. I think he's understanding that he's got to control some costs. And that's really difficult in the public sector, because when you look at schools, when you look at cities, 80–85% of their cost is payroll. Payroll and benefits. And so that's a really difficult thing to tackle. So I was just impressed with his attitude. I hope he I hope he does well.
Did you give him any advice on what you think he might need to do to improve the business climate in the city?
You know what's interesting, I had asked him if he had seen Rudy Giuliani speak. Probably 15 years ago, he came out and spoke at Kutztown. And someone in the audience afterwards said, "Do you have any advice for the city of Reading?" And he said, "You know, I wouldn't be so presumptuous as to give people advice. I'll tell you what I did in New York City. And one is, you stop the petty crime. You just don't tolerate anything. They had, you know, squeegee men in New York that would jump out at the traffic light. Just don't tolerate that. Clean up the streets and focus on the schools. And if you do those three things, you make the city safer, cleaner, and you improve the schools, people will move back in the city." So, you know, I shared that with him as Giuliani's advice, and I'm sure Giuliani knows more about running cities than I do.
Now, we talked when we emailed a little bit about plastics as an industry.
Sure.
What are the 2 or 3 biggest business pressures that people in your line of work face now, and what are you doing to deal with those?
I think the biggest pressures, we're probably in a far different position than most plastics manufacturers. So we're doing a process called rotational molding. Most of our parts are relatively large to very large. And you'll see in the photograph, you know, I'm standing next to a part that's taller than me. We really don't have the offshore pressure. We make a lot of large things, and we make them in relatively small quantities. If you're an injection molder, you may be making millions of a part that's this big. That's something the Chinese are interested in. Lots of parts, small parts, easy to ship. I make $11 million worth of parts a year, but that's probably 2,000 different parts. So there's not enough volume in any one part that it pays for somebody overseas to make molds and try and penetrate the market, because there just isn't the volume. So we don't face those pressures. Our pressures really are regulatory issues, and most of those actually come down on the personnel side. Employment rules.
Making sure you're not hiring any undocumented workers.
Right, right. And recruiting people, difficulties finding good people. A lot of that's driven by the education process. So a high school degree doesn't mean what a high school degree used to mean. It's a very high percentage of college freshmen have to take remedial courses. So finding people that can do basic math, finding people that can write a letter, those are all challenges now.
That says something about the state of our educational system, which goes back to that point that you made about Rudy Giuliani.
Right.
There's a larger lesson about how we need to do a better job of preparing high school students to go out either to college or into the workforce, being able to do those kinds of things.
Yeah, but I don't see where the drive is to get that done. I mean, if we go back to October timeframe and you look at the city of Chicago and their teachers went on strike, 60% of their kids don't graduate from high school. If a business had 60% of their products go in the scrap heap, they'd be out of business. They wouldn't be out striking because they wanted to get paid more. Why would you pay somebody that 60% of their output is failure? So I don't see the drive for that one. I don't see what's the motivator that makes stuff get done. And so I think that's really where you're seeing the birth of some of the charter schools as an alternative. But the fact that taxpayers are just willing to let the public school system continue to do what it's doing and not force it to have a different result, it's kind of frustrating, and I'm glad I'm not in the public sector.
We'll let that be the last word, Peter. Thank you for your time.
Okay.